Dario, every time I talk to him, I'm kind of blown away. I mean, the certainty with which he tells us this and the mind-blowing scale of change and the speed with which it's going to happen. But as I said in the conversation with him, I used to just listen to this and kind of raise my eyebrows. And now I don't, because the pace of change that has happened has been so fast. But one constraint that Dario mentioned briefly, and one important factor in how fast this happens and who can do it, is going to be energy. And so it is really it's not a difficult segue. It's in fact an important segue to the next conversation, because energy is not just because it's powering the AI revolution, but energy. We've got an administration in the US that has a very different view to the kinds of energy you should have and how you should think about it. It's going to be, what's the phrase here? We're going to find clarity amid chaos. And I think we're in a transition in the world of energy too. And so we're going to talk about energy and AI first, and then we're going to talk about the geopolitics of energy. This is a terrific panel of experts who I think will bring definitely clarity to this. Honestly, Dan Yergin's literally written the book that you need to read, Vice Chairman on S&P Global. Meghan O'Sullivan, Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and co-author with and co-conspirator with Jason Bordoff, who's the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. You are two people, when I want to have a three people, smart take on where the energy world is heading, I talk to one of you. So, with no further ado, tell me what the consequences of the world that Dario has laid out, the pace at which this is happening, the pace at which compute is going to increase, and the energy demands that are going to be required to run these geniuses in a data center. They're going to be smarter than us and power the world. Jason, I'll start with you. How do we power that? What's it going to mean for energy, for global energy demand?
Yeah, so part of the answer to that is we have no idea. So if you look,
that's not a good answer.
If you look at the pace, you look at the projections for electricity demand growth from AI, they're all over the map, and that's because there's a huge amount of uncertainty. We could fill this room and many like it with reports from the late 1990s about how electricity demand was going to go through the roof because of the internet revolution. And none of that ever happened because the technology and the chip productivity kept improving. And so we don't really have a clear sense yet of the use cases for this technology, how the NVIDIA chip efficiency will continue to improve. We do know that it is bullish for electricity demand, and we see that all over the world. The pace, we're in an age now that is different from ones in the past where electricity demand is growing much faster than it has before. And what's different is that used to be true in the developing economies that have very little access to energy. It's now in the developed world. The U.S. lost muscle memory for the last 20 years with how to meet rising electricity demand, because electricity demand was flat for the last 20 years. It's growing again now, and if you read President Trump's executive order declaring a national energy emergency, it was as much about the power sector and grid reliability as it was about drill, baby, drill, and oil and gas. So we know that power demand is going to go up. And we can come back to where that power is going to come from and what it means for the clean energy transition in just a moment. But the last thing I'll say is the most consequential thing about what Dario said for the energy sector is, in my view, less likely to be how much energy it takes as what this tool can do for the energy sector and many other sectors. AI is an incredibly powerful tool to use energy more efficiently, to manage our demand, to use predictive tools to better manage renewable energy. So I do think on net, the capability of these tools, which we're just understanding, and he obviously knows a million times more about, the energy for AI, which gets a lot of attention, is very consequential, but AI as a tool for energy is probably in the long run going to matter much more. When you look at, you'll hear Fatih, I think at the end of this conversation, Fatih Birol, who in the takeaway from the World Energy Outlook was we're entering the age of electricity, demand for electricity is going to rise. Electricity demand growth was twice that of overall energy demand over the last decade. It's going to be 6 times overall energy demand over the next decade. 3 times, according to the World Energy Outlook from the IEA, demand for electricity for air conditioning is going to exceed that for AI or data centers by 3 or 4-fold. So it just put it in perspective that we're increasing electricity demand considerably as we move to hopefully a decarbonized world, we can go back to what Trump means for that. And we try to electrify cars and other things that weren't electric before. We meet rising electricity demand for things like air conditioning in lower income countries and AI and data centers, but it's probably the smaller chunk compared to a lot of those other things.
So Fatih, just so for you all to know, because you can say as much about the IEA as you like, because he's actually unable to join us. So feel free to jump in, and we can talk for a little longer than we were able to. Meghan, first of all, I'm not going to ask you, do you agree with Jason? Well, maybe you don't always agree, but is it a question of timing that in the short term we're going to see increased demand for energy from AI, but over the longer term we may see increased, transformational impact on how energy is created? I mean, remember, I think Sam Altman said to me last year, we're going to bring the marginal cost of intelligence down to zero, and we're going to bring the marginal cost of energy down to zero, thanks to AI. And are there, whether it's fusion, whatever it is there things that AI is going to bring that we have a kind of time shift now, like for the next few years, there's going to be huge energy demand. And then, as Jason suggested, it may change the economics of energy. Do you see it the same way?
I think the possibility is certainly there. But I know you don't like the answer. It's hard to know. But in fact, that is the answer, that it is hard to know exactly when these two things are going to play out and cancel each other out. And when we think about AI in the interest of the energy transition, broadly speaking, it's not only in how we use energy and how we gain efficiencies, it's also in terms of what kind of materials we use. AI will come up with new materials that make energy more efficient, that make it you need less energy to make certain materials. You can make certain materials that are greener. This will affect buildings and building codes. It will have an impact on the overall energy system as a whole. So not just about how much electricity we'd use. If I could pick up a little bit, you intimated like what are some of the implications of this surge in demand for electricity? And to give some numbers, you gave some global numbers, and I know we're not in the U.S., but for the U.S., to put in perspective, right now, data centers are using about 4% of U.S. electricity demand, and the expectation is that could triple in the next few years to 12 or 13%, which is still not, it's not deafening, but in a context in which the U.S. in particular has had really no growth in electricity demand over the last 20 years, the question is, can the system actually take it? So what was interesting to me is if we had had more time for you to drill down with Dario, what else is on your list, whether or not energy was going to be one of those things that could stop it from happening. Because I think there are real questions about how much energy can be brought to bear in this time frame that we're talking about, 2 to 3 years. So if he's talking about models that use 1 million chips, the next question is, well, how much energy does that take? And obviously there's a lot of effort to make chips more efficient, but we could be talking about requiring one model training 1 gigawatt of energy, 5 gigawatts of energy. I mean, huge amounts of energy. And the question is that all going to be able to be harnessed in one geographic location in a single country? Is it going to require other sectors not consume electricity? And we can get to the Trump administration. I think there's some real questions there. I'll just finish by saying, before Monday, I was nervous that this AI revolution could mean we get derailed from the energy transition to where the baseline was for the transition. Since Monday, I'm now hopeful that the AI situation will actually somehow keep America on an energy transition track, because we're going to need all kinds of energy in order to meet those big demands.
Elaborate on that a bit more, that there's so much energy going to be needed that whether or not the president believes in it, there will be a focus on clean energy. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is there are just a number of things that are hard to reconcile altogether. One is this very significant demand in electricity that we're going to see in a very short time period. 2 is how to build that extra energy capacity and that grid capacity, and just rely on one energy source. It's possible America can do it just with natural gas, but it's also possible that we will need more energy sources if we want to meet one of other one of Trump's others big objective, which is to keep down the cost of energy for Americans. And so if you're taking away certain energy sources or no longer seeking to grow them or seeking to build a competitive edge in areas that have seen real advancement in the last several years, that, I could see that you might have to get pragmatic, and that might mean, hey, it's useful not to say we're not going to have any wind. It's useful to say, well, let's keep some of these incentives we have in place. Let's use some of these enhanced abilities to permit energy projects to actually build some renewable energy, as well as to build nuclear power plants or natural gas facilities.
We're going to come to all the many things that Trump has said about energy in the last 48 hours in a second. But first, Dan Yergin, can you put what we've just heard about what AI is going to imply into the historical context? Because you've thought about the energy market. You've written the book on it. You've thought about it throughout the last.
He's written many books on it.
I know, but there are books, sir. But I'm just thinking about there are many history books indeed. How does this fit? Is this going to be a bigger change than the things that you have documented in the past? Is it going to be smaller? Will this be another book, or will be another chapter in your future books?
Well, first of all, your interview was so fantastic and thought-provoking that I'm still processing it and trying to think through the implications of it. What strikes me is that lots of discussion about energy has been about energy security, about oil, and now it's about electricity. And that, to me, is quite a big change, and they've laid it out. And remember, at least in the United States, I mean, in other places too, this is coming on top of energy transition demand, like charging cars, reshoring manufacturing, crypto mining, and now you have this on top of it. And I won't say there's, at least in the United States, there's a panic, but there's a high anxiety about, and 15 months ago it wasn't there, about how are you going to meet this. And I think they've laid out the factors, and it's just the ability, I mean, within utilities, can you get things built? Can you get them permitted? What about your supply chains? We're sold out and so forth. So I think there's a lot of pressure in the system right now, and people trying to do it. And this emergency order, as they've described, is really striking that it's about permitting, a lot of it about electricity and about natural gas. And the question that Meghan raised, which is that whereas the Biden administration was about phasing out natural gas from electric generation, it sure looks like it's going to be a lot more natural gas and electric generation.
Well, let's talk then about what to make of the executive order. Orders.
Which one?
Yeah, executive orders as regards energy. What's your, whatever it is now, 72 hours in, what's your assessment of what the impact of the practical application of what during the campaign was just drill, baby, drill, and now we have some meat on that. What is the Trump administration going to imply for U.S. energy? Meghan, let's start with you, and then I'll go to Jason.
Sure. I think there's a lot of flash around these EOs and when they come to energy and climate in particular. And I think there's the first impression that many of us have, which I think is, again, quite dramatic, a real lurch towards the development of fossil fuels and away from renewables and energy transition. I think when you look more closely at them, and, in full transparency, I haven't been able to read all of them in the time here at Davos, but even looking at some of them in some depth, there's a little bit more nuance there. And there's also the reality that, a lot of the things that the Trump administration is leaning into in the drill, baby, drill category is probably not exactly what the oil and gas industry is thirsting for. I think there's less of this real pent-up desire to drill more, to add more, rigs to the Permian, and it's more an interest in other parts of supporting the industry. And so I think what the Trump administration does offer to this industry is the opportunity to have a conversation that was missing in the Biden administration, and to talk about, okay, what does the industry need? How can the industry be supported? And in some cases, there are parts of the industry that have started to make investments into technologies that they're going to want to keep doing and that the United States and the world is going to need later. So I'm hopeful that this initial flash can end up in a conversation that might be a lot more nuanced than it looks at this first moment.
Jason, do you agree with that? And what does it mean for the US's commitment to green energy, which was notably struck out by the executive orders?
Yeah, I largely agree, not surprisingly, and I would just add, we were kind of asking where the energy can we scale. What Dan said and Meghan said, can we get the energy quickly enough for this rapid growth in electricity caused by what we didn't notice 15 months ago, the surge in demand from AI. I just note that was coming on top of grid regulators and operators already, even before this, warning about grid reliability and a system that was on its last legs, and the auction price for reserve emergency capacity in one part of the country in the mid-Atlantic was 9 times last summer what it had been the year before. So people were already concerned about the state of the grid. So it's not just do we have the energy. We have more cheap gas in the United States than we know what to do with for a very long time. Then we can talk about clean energy and renewables. We have a lot of those resources too. But it's a question of how you bring that online and can the system accommodate it in the short time frame that is needed. On day one, a lot of what Trump did was, not unexpected. One of our fellows actually at the Center on Global Energy Policy helped to write some of those because he was part of leading the transition team at the Energy Department until a few days ago. So we're a bipartisan, nonpartisan institution. And you had opening up the offshore to drilling. Now, if you go back and look under Obama, Trump, Biden, and look at the acreage offered to the industry for lease, it skyrocketed under Trump. If you looked at what the industry actually paid money to buy, it didn't change because that was determined by the global price of oil and whether it made any economic sense. And a lot of companies, I don't know that Dan can correct me if he disagrees, are eager to drill off California or North Carolina because Trump has said they can bid on acreage there if they want to. We had a big debate in the U.S. about a pause on permitting for LNG exports, and he lifted that. LNG exports were already going to double over the course of the next couple of years in the United States, which is going to raise tension between the rapid growth in gas demand for AI and industry on top of the what Dario said. He said we need more energy in the U.S. and we need to send energy to allies around the world. We're going to surge demand for gas from LNG. That's in tension with Trump's desire to keep energy prices low. And so while we were all talking about whether Biden would limit exports in the future, the possibility that it becomes a political constraint in the United States to say, let's put America first and keep energy prices low here before we help people halfway around the world is a not inconceivable scenario. I can go down the list of the things he did. I mean, to Meghan's point, this could be all of the above and good for renewables. What Biden did to put the offshore off limits to oil and gas drilling, Trump reversed that and did it for offshore wind. So it just gives you a sense. They're not like that supportive of offshore wind, and we can come back to whether some of the tax credits will be at risk. So those are the things that were announced, and I do think market forces are going to determine a lot of the consequences of that much more than the regulatory changes. Certainly there'll be an ease in regulation, making it easier to build pipelines and be supportive of oil and gas production, but market fundamentals will, I don't think people are meaningfully changing their total projections for U.S. oil and gas production growth over the next couple of years versus before. I do share some of Meghan's optimism, and it's a timing question because we're definitely going to use a lot of gas. We were going to do that even if Harris had won or Biden were president for just to meet, because the power demands for these hyperscalers is really existential, that they grow capacity quickly, and you just can't wait for small modular reactors to come online in 10 years. The thing you can do fast is gas, and there's a 5-year wait list for a new combined cycle gas turbine from GE Vernova because everyone's trying to deploy gas infrastructure as fast as possible. But in addition to that, they care about their green credentials. They have a lot of money to spend, and they are signing real contracts to accelerate the pace of nuclear deployment. This administration could be one of the most pro-nuclear that we have ever seen in the United States. It will take permitting reform seriously, not just to make it easier to build oil and gas pipelines, but transmission lines and permitting for a nuclear plant through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other things. So the ability that over the next couple of years, an eased regulatory environment, a focus on building again, keeping energy prices low and affordable, cost and inflation is a very high priority for the Trump administration. At the same time that we're using more gas in the near term, that does, I agree with Meghan, have the potential to bring the cost down of other energy technologies, and we're probably not going to build coal plants, so we are talking mostly about low or zero carbon energy sources, that when the focus shifts back to the need to decarbonize, and that will come back because it has to, given what we have in store for us with climate change, there will be more tools at our disposal at lower cost than maybe is the case today because of the driver we now have of meeting rising energy demand driven by AI and other factors.
I'm going to open to questions in just a second, but Dan, for you, where do you think this nets out on the trajectory of the oil price?
So can you just tell me what's going to happen to GDP? I mean, really. I mean, it seems to be we've had a oil price within a range, but I'm not going to make a price prediction.
No, it's not. But more
Depends a lot with
directionally.
Russia, Iran, and Venezuela.
Yeah,
I mean, look, if there are more
sanctions.
sanctions, I mean, these sanctions on Russia, which Jason's point are really the tough ones. And it's interesting that the Biden administration was very worried about doing anything that would actually cause gasoline prices to rise in election year. So it's very interesting that like 1 week before they're out of office, they put these much tougher sanctions on, and it's the next guy's problem. So I think that...
well, maybe it was done with some coordination with the next guy, because it's a very powerful tool of leverage.
I doubt it.
Well, the kinds of the sanctions that the Biden administration put on are sanctions that specifically need Congress to lift them. So it's not the kind that the next executive would want to put in place because they're not as much as in his control. But today, Trump did put out quite a verbose tweet to Vladimir Putin about get ready for more sanctions on your oil if you don't stop this war. So I think there certainly is the real possibility that Trump will look to put more restrictions on Russian energy into global markets at the same time that he will definitely look to do that with Iran. So I do think you have those pieces there on the geopolitical front, which could have, in my mind, more of an impact on price than some of these regulatory issues that we're talking about in EOs. It depends on a number of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it depends on OPEC Plus and a number of other things, but that's actually more the impact to watch than
on the oil price,
on the price.
Dan.
Yeah, because if you look, under Biden, Iranian oil exports went up considerably, almost to where they were before. So if pressure on them, pressure on Russia, you're taking oil off the market. You have the spare capacity in the Gulf countries that they can put in, but it does create a different situation in the market. And players in the market are trying to figure out, well, we don't want to get sanctioned. We don't want secondary sanctions. So these are pretty strong.
That's a very clear example of the geopolitical uncertainty meeting the uncertainty that's coming from energy demand from this whole AI push. Questions? Martin, your hand is always up first, but go for it.
Okay, very simple. As far as I can see, we're basically now at 1.5 degrees centigrade above in pre-industrial levels. Give me your best estimate of where we'll be in 2035.
I think that, for temperature rise, I don't know if a decade is the right time frame.
Okay.
But
you can give me 2035, 2045, 2055. I don't mind.
So when people look at net zero targets and what's consistent with stabilizing temperature, it's usually a 2100 kind of time frame. And so if you look at the net zero scenario from the IEA that Fatih, who was going to be here, had put together, what was important about that, and the reason some of the assumptions in it seemed so crazy to people, is not just what does the world need to look like in 2050. The harder stuff to imagine was what the world need to look like in 2030, and that's because the shape of the curve matters for cumulative emissions. So right now, the projections are somewhere probably between 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius is the trajectory that we're currently on. If you go back to when the Paris Agreement was signed a decade ago, probably people would have told you we're on track for somewhere between 3.5 to 4.5. So progress is possible, and we're not making progress nearly fast enough to keep temperature to below 2 degrees. 1.5 is almost impossible at this point.
Trump is
Someone-
a blip in this.
Is in that time frame we're losing the ability to continue to make progress. We don't know. It depends what happens to the Inflation Reduction Act. It depends what people in Congress do to the support for the EV mandate. And what we're mostly losing is the ability to continue to prioritize this issue with the urgency it deserves and make progress faster than we are. I do believe that, and I think this is important for companies to keep in mind who think everything has suddenly changed. We're having a conversation now, not just in the US, but in Europe too, I think, you tell me, where security and economic competitiveness are top of the agenda before people are talking about sustainability, although they're still talking about it in Europe, perhaps a little bit more. You look at the history of the American environmental movement, There's a great book by the American historian Douglas Brinkley actually about this, and you go through the 40s and 50s and 60s when we polluted the air and the water and smog in Los Angeles, and the book by Rachel Carson about DDT, and it took a decade after that book for us to actually do anything about DDT. But when change happened, it happened all of a sudden. And 1 out of 10 Americans came into the streets on the first Earth Day in 1970 and kind of demanded change. We just can't live like this anymore. Something has to change, and that's why Richard Nixon, not necessarily a great environmentalist, signed the landmark environmental laws we still have today. I believe that moment is coming for climate. I don't know exactly when and how, but if we are expecting what we think we're expecting, we can't be here in 20 years and be as complacent with the impacts of climate change as I feel like people are today.
Megan, you wanted to jump in.
No, I just wanted, someone said something to me and actually Jason earlier today that I think is worth repeating in terms of the temperature rise that we're looking at. So the IEA predicts 2.4 if we stay on this current trajectory for 2100. And compared, this is very consistent with what Jason said. So the worst case situation is now much better, but the best case situation is now much worse. Because, so that it kind of speaks for itself, I think. And sorry, Dan, just one last thing. For what it's worth, my own feeling is that we will seriously consider and deploy geoengineering before we get to that point. So that may be the prediction that the models tell us, but I think we will, we meaning humanity, whatever spheres of influence that Trump has created and whatever condominiums are out there or however the governance structure has emerged, this will be a real option for humanity and one that will be taken very seriously given the consequences of even something like 2.4.
So I don't want to front run here, but I do, with a couple of co-authors, I have an article coming out in a couple of weeks in Foreign Affairs, which probably has, you won't like it, Martin, because it basically says, I think that a lot of the thinking about energy transition congealed during COVID when demand was down and prices were down, and you can draw a straight line, and that the energy transition actually needs to be rethought in light of the experience of the last couple of years in terms of growth, population, north-south disagreements, the return of what they've talked about, energy security and so forth, economic growth, other issues. Look what's happening in Europe. So I think that it's going to be hard to rethink it, but it's not going to be as straightforward as it looked.
Can I ask you what you mean by rethought? Like, what are the ingredients of this rethinking?
Well, rethinking. Pardon?
Martin said it means abandoned.
No, it doesn't mean that, but it means being realistic, Martin, and just saying, what's actually happening in the world. What about the 3 billion people in the world who use less electricity annually every year than an American refrigerator? That's what it means.
But it means going more slowly.
It means more slowly, more complicated, and the phrase we use is multidimensional.
More multidimensional. That's an excellent Davos phrase. More multidimensional. Question. Yes, gentleman there.
Hi. In the context of ever-increasing importance of hydrogen as a component in the energy transition, what do you see as the main blockers to speed up the adoption of this technology?
Who wants to take that? What's going to
I would say, I know we're running short on time, so I'll be brief. There's an enormous amount of interest in making low-carbon hydrogen right now, and none in buying it. It's just too expensive. And I think right now the demand signals are not there. So a lot of the projects are really challenged. Europe has a goal of 20 million tons, and last year was 1/10 of a ton. So we're pretty far from meeting our goals.
Another question? Yes. There.
You did mention the people that use less electricity than the fridge in the U.S. or their plasma TV. Do you see any scenario where it would be in the interest of the U.S. or the EU to help these countries to acquire electricity?
Megan.
Yeah, I think it's in every interest of the United States to help the rest of the world meet the dual goals of energy security and carbon reduction. And I haven't read Dan's article, and I'm excited to read it, because I do think that this is a moment to rethink what we mean by the energy transition and how we're going to achieve it, and to recognize that any energy transition without energy security is not going to be successful. And this has always been true for the global South. And now with the political shifts and the rise in populism in the West, I think that's becoming more obvious to us in the United States and to Europe and other places. My concern is that the Trump administration will not prioritize this. The Biden administration talked a lot about it, and I think genuinely wanted to see greater assistance go to the global south in terms of making the energy transition, but it was very small in actuality. And on the other hand, if you think about the leaders in Beijing, what they must have been planning for in the advent of a Trump administration is a variety of things, but one of them would be how to take advantage of America withdrawing from leadership in this. And I don't just mean withdrawing from Paris. I mean not having ambitions to help the global south actually build infrastructure that's compatible with American technologies. And China's advantages in the clean energy supply chains are vast and also probably underestimated. And this is a space where, you know, China could definitely decide this is an open playing field for them. And certainly the need is there in the global south.
But I think that point is one reason why there may be some reason for optimism. I mean, one of the primary tools the U.S. would have to do that would be the Development Finance Corporation, which comes up for reauthorization this year. That was created by the Trump administration as sort of our counter to Belt and Road, not nearly as with as much teeth. But when you're not talking about climate, and that's not the motivator, but you're talking about diversifying supply chains from China and reducing Chinese influence and mining for critical minerals. And will that be about LNG projects and oil and gas too? For sure. But there is a lot of opportunity for U.S. companies to engage in countering Chinese soft power and create opportunities for U.S. firms by getting government support to de-risk investments in a broad range of energy, including a lot of clean energy.
Dan.
So just maybe I was a little sharp in replying to Martin, but you know, I think that the appointed constraint is here's where geopolitics and energy transition collide when you get to the subject of China in terms of its domination of the processing as well as mining. And those are very critical questions. And for instance, an electric car has 2.5, 3 times more copper than a conventional car. By the way, it takes 20 years at least to develop a new mine. So minerals is a constraint there. And the other point to make is ever since the energy transition began in January of 1709, energy transitions have taken about 100 years, and it's been energy addition as well as energy transition. And if you look at the numbers, that's where we are today. And one critical question for developing countries is what's going to be the role of natural gas in enabling them to bridge to a future, including one using electricity, as opposed to burning wood.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Can I see if there's any more questions? No more questions. Oh, yes, one last one.
Yes, I'm a European, so maybe you have some advice for us in terms of our energy policy.
Okay, how long have we got?
Just 3 quick wins, maybe.
Silence. Okay, Jason, you're advising the Europeans. What are the top 3 priorities? I'm going to ask you all the same thing.
Well, according to Ursula von der Leyen, the top 3 priorities for the new European Commissioner are to stay the course on decarbonization, bring energy prices down, and bring Russian gas imports to zero. The problem is it's hard to do all 3 of those things at the same time. And there have been a number of self-inflicted wounds that have harmed European economic competitiveness. Europe didn't get off of Russian gas. Russia got Europe off of its gas by cutting supply. And, you know, the way Europe coped with that was to expose itself to the volatility of the global LNG market year to year. So last winter, everyone took a victory lap. Look how well we did getting off of Russian gas. And this winter's much tougher, right? So gas prices have roughly doubled because you're subject to the vicissitudes of the global LNG market. So a regulatory structure that integrates the market better, allows better trade, both in gas but also electricity across borders. Deep mistakes, in my view, were made on nuclear power, and which are imposing huge self-inflicted wounds in Europe. And I do think in the long run that deploying more clean energy helps to reduce that exposure to oil and gas that are inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk in the global market and can help provide some stability too. But bringing energy prices down has to be a core focus now for European economic competitiveness. I mean, we've done a number of papers at the Center on Global Energy Policy about how, the industrial gas demand in Europe, particularly Germany, is not coming back. And that is sort of permanent destruction caused by high prices. And I think policymakers need to acknowledge that and kind of address it.
Get prices down. Meghan, what's your prescription?
Well, I think Jason laid out a number of things. Those would be exactly the same. I just going back to what we were talking about, kind of the political support for an energy transition. If an energy transition in Europe involves high prices and insecure energy stability, there's not going to be any long-term political support for the kind of transition that some leaders have hoped for. So I think you have to take into account the need to be more competitive, more economically vibrant, and to prioritize energy security alongside carbon mitigation and reduction.
So I'm going to put it slightly different to you, but it's the same question. Has Europe had it, given how high its energy costs are?
Well, I don't think it's only the energy costs. By the way, I do want to say we've talked about renewables in terms of climate and so forth. Renewables are also important for diversification and energy security. I mean, that's an important part of the equation, too. I think Europe needs to look at its energy policies in terms of deindustrialization. I don't know if it's correct. One person here, one from one of the companies, said there have been, over the last 3 years, there have been 48,000 pages of regulations relating to the chemical industry. I mean, I think it's not, you can't just say it's because of high energy prices. It's also a structure of regulation that seems to be rather divorced from the realities of the market.
It's deindustrialization, but also to circle the whole conversation back. How can Europe possibly become a kind of a winner in an AI world with energy costs where they are and the ability to innovate where it is? I mean, somebody said to me yesterday, the simple way of looking at the world now is America, tech, optimism, growth. Europe, no tech, no optimism, no growth. It's kind of a stark way of putting it. We are going to have to wrap up. I'm really sorry. I know there are other questions, and I was told by my colleagues that I had to synthesize this conversation. There is no way I can do this. AI will do it for me. I'm just going to end by kind of sort of repeating some of the things that really struck me. One, Dario says that by 26, 27, and we remember we are now at the beginning of 25. We are going to have geniuses in data centers that are going to be smarter than humans and more capable than humans on all, essentially the panoply of human intelligent activity within 2 years. He also thinks that when he's feeling optimistic, we're going to have 10x the pace of biological and medical innovation. So in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see what we would have otherwise seen in 50 to 100 years. He also thinks that this is essentially all but inevitable. The only thing that could derail this would be a massive geopolitical catastrophe. But he recognizes that we are in a world where geopolitics is particularly uncertain, and he called it a perfect storm. We then moved on to the one area of constraint. There are probably 3 areas of constraints. One is talent, one is capital, and one is energy for this AI revolution. You, I think, gave me more optimism than I was expecting on the ability to actually kind of ease that constraint, and that the Trump administration was probably best understood as a kind of all of the above menu, like everything you can eat menu, rather than just drill, baby, drill. But, to Martin's point, we were still going to see global temperatures rise by quite a lot more than the 1.5 that is now impossible, 3%. But you said, long before that happens, there will be action, because people will demand action, and it may be geoengineering. And geoengineering, I'm going to leave you with this thought, which is, in my simple, non-technical mind, throwing paint into space. Geoengineering, I submit to you, the decision on whether that happens will be done by a super intelligent AI. We will all be kind of sitting around, and that super intelligent AI will optimize. The question is, will it optimize for the world of AIs, or will it optimize for the rest of us? So I leave you with that. Thank you all very much indeed.